All right. Well, hey, Joseph. Glad we'll connect, right? Like I said, wanted to really learn more about your journey, how you ended up where you did end up, and kind of lessons you can kind of share with people from that journey. The first thing I want to kind of ask is, what's your adjustment been like since coming back to the Bay from Los Angeles?
Well, moving back up here has been great. I actually quite like Los Angeles quite a bit, but definitely in terms of the culture, in terms of the type of people, where priorities are, it's a little bit different. So I like both places, but I'll say I like the San Francisco Bay Area a little bit more.
How long were you down in LA for again?
I was there for about a year and a half.
Okay. And then what do you think the difference is? Is it more just the weather? Is it the people, the culture? Or...
Right. Well, I would say that I think the San Francisco Bay Area is a little bit more similar. Like a lot of the communities, a lot of the people are more similar. Whereas when you go to LA, you drive 15 minutes in different directions, and it's really different communities, different kinds of people, and just the emphasis in terms of what's important in LA is a little bit different here. There's more, everybody's got a script. I would say that generally speaking, from a workplace perspective, that relationships and having longer term relationships is a little bit more important in LA versus in San Francisco. I think there's a higher emphasis in terms of performance. And I think that's the way that people are regarded more so here than in LA. And in LA, it's more about long-term relationships, betting on specific people. And I would say loyalty is more important than performance in LA, from my perspective.
Interesting. Okay. And is there one you would prefer over the other, or do you think it's just a different type of game, so to speak?
Yeah, no, I mean, having been raised and being more of a Silicon Valley type of guy, I would say that culturally, the San Francisco Bay Area is a closer fit for me. But it was interesting to be in LA for a little while, and also to develop skills from a relationship perspective as well. So that was for me, it was a good experience.
Yeah. And then I guess, so the point of coming back to the Bay, I know you're kind of taking over or leaving from NBC to kind of do more of your own studio, your own education, your own leadership kind of approach to things. Was coming to the Bay more metaphorical for that, or was there more I just want to get LA as well?
No. Yeah, it was basically, so what happened was I was working at NBC Universal, and certainly there was, kind of speaking to what we were just talking about, there was certainly, I would say, a cultural conflict in terms of how I like to run teams and what I believe is required for longer term success, especially in an industry like the, free-to-play mobile games industry. So, back in about May of this year, the conflicts got to a point where, not technically, but practically, I was essentially fired. So, definitely didn't see eye to eye with, my boss, and I just could not get on board with how things were being done. Things like that. Anyway, it was a clash, and so effectively was fired from that job. And I felt like this, just given my age, I'm an older guy, but given my age, given where I am in life, that I felt like this would be my last opportunity to try and do something entrepreneurial. And I felt a strong desire to want to build so one, I saw a lot of changes in terms of the industry and the environment. And I felt that this would be a rare opportunity for me to try and start a company in the way that I think the market is moving, the way that I believe is required to achieve long-term sustainable success, and to build a culture that I believe in. So that was one. And so the reason for moving back up here, though, was essentially cost. That, I had bought a house here in Silicon. And it's kind of funny because when I tell people I'm moving back up to the San Francisco Bay Area
for the cost.
But the point is that I bought a house here at a good time. I put a shit ton of money down. So for the cost of renting a studio or 1-bedroom apartment in LA, I could have a 5-bedroom house in Silicon Valley, and my mortgage in LA was 3 to 4x my mortgage here, just because of that reason. So I sold my house in LA and moved back up to the San Francisco Bay Area, actually for cost, to reduce costs, because it's not clear when I'm gonna be able to make money trying to start a new game studio. So just to reduce costs and to give myself as long of a runway as possible, move back up to the San Francisco Bay Area.
Very cool. So then is GameMakers isn't the studio you're doing, right? That's more of a...
GameMakers is a brand. So I had started a blog back in around, from the early days, like 2011, 2012, something like that.
Okay.
And the blog the blog was about game development. And essentially the reason why I started that blog is, not to talk too much and get into the weeds, but, early in my career, I started off as a software developer. So I didn't know much about business. And then so from software development, I went to management consulting, which taught me more about business, but more from a strategic perspective. And then I started a mobile game studio at a time where I kind of had a technical background and a strategic background, but didn't know anything about watching your cash flow, running a team, managing and incentivizing a team. And so it wasn't surprising that I wasn't very successful. So it was kind of weird, because I was at the right time, at the right place in terms of the mobile gaming industry and free to play, but I was the wrong guy, right? So I didn't have the skills to properly execute against a perfect opportunity to create a great company right at the right time. So a lot of other people in San Francisco Bay Area who were there were able to capitalize on a lot of the opportunities at that point in time much better than I was. In that regard, I completely failed. But I started the blog. It was originally called Quarter View, but I changed the name later to GameMakers, about the free-to-play game development process. So just to kind of expand a little bit more on that. So I had a blog, but I wasn't writing that much on the blog. And a friend of mine, his name is Mishka Katkov, who runs a blog called the Deconstructor of Fun, which actually is much more popular, much more successful. So Mishka asked, he noticed that I had not been writing very much on the GameMakers blog, so he asked me to write for the Deconstructor of Fun, which I did. And then, sorry, this is turning into a long story, but
go for it.
So then wrote on the Deconstructor of Fun blog. Actually just only wrote like 2 or 3 posts on Deconstructor of Fun, but they got a massive number of views. And then I visited. Mishka actually invited me out to go to RovioCon last year, which is Rovio's conference. I went out there, and he had been doing some podcasts, but not very frequently. And so I did a podcast with him for the Deconstructor Fun podcast. I was so bad at it. Like, it was just terrible. I don't know. I was nervous or something. It was bad.
Yeah.
And then because I was so bad, I asked Mishka, I talked to Mishka and I was like, hey, sorry, that was so terrible. And he's like, it took him 10 episodes before he got good at podcasting. And so I just recommended, hey, why don't we do like a gaming news type of podcast, because I need the practice. And he agreed. And then when we started doing it, it was more as just, a way for me to get better at podcasting. But then it just started to grow organically. And it is now a podcast that has become so popular that when I go to conferences, people actually recognize me for having done that podcast. But to take this even further, so I saw the power of the podcast. And another thing that kind of happened at the end of last year was actually in a kickboxing class, I tore my Achilles heel.
Okay.
Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, I actually took some film of the doctor that was looking at my Achilles heel and giving me like the diagnosis that it was completely torn. But it was actually a chiropractor, because I had to be seen immediately, and my wife's chiropractor agreed to see me. And then when I posted the video of the doctor giving me that sort of prognosis on my Achilles heel in our company Slack channel. And then it turns out like a bunch of like 2 or 3 people recognized my chiropractor. And I was like, wow, how did you recognize him? And they're like, well, that's Dr. Jason. I was like, who's Dr. Jason? And he's like, well, he's famous on YouTube. And then, so I looked him up and I was like, oh my God, he's got like 300,000 subscribers on YouTube.
Yeah.
People in LA recognize him. So from there, that kind of made me realize that there are a lot of younger, people in their 20s and 30s, a lot of younger folks at the office who are basically just watching YouTube all the time. And so I thought that it'd be interesting to try and do some content on YouTube. So that was like, I think the podcast gave me confidence that maybe I could also try and do something for YouTube. And so started the YouTube channel based, kind of with the same name as the blog GameMakers, and have been starting to create content for YouTube as well. Now, YouTube's been a lot harder than the podcast. I'll say that for sure. Yeah. But I think from the perspective of it achieving what I wanted to achieve, it's been a massive success. But from, like, I would say, a subscriber growth perspective, it's been a lot more difficult getting users in, kind of an audience on YouTube relative to the podcast.
Well, I know like there's some videos you posted where you're kind of like sharing your milestones, like have you reached those goals, where you at? And I know in one of your first ones, you mentioned like, oh, my goal is to get 1,000 subscribers. I'm barely here.
Yeah. So there was a reason why I haven't posted updates to the goals video. Okay. Which is that I've actually abandoned all the goals. And I've kind of changed. And there's a video that I need to make that explains why. And there's a part of the reason why is because, the company that we were working with asked us not to post any updates until their deal got cleared. And so I can talk about that now.
Oh, okay.
But I would say that the way that I was measuring the goals and what I was doing was not correct. And so I will be posting a video that kind of explains what happened and how I've changed my goals. But, the point is that the way that I was measuring my goals was appropriate if you have a stable environment. But if you don't have a stable environment, the objectives and the way to measure whether you're achieving your goals or not should be different. And so I'm going to explain that in a future video.
Okay.
And then I think just in terms of what I was focused on, right, which was I was trying to get to like 3,000 YouTube subscribers. I also feel that is the wrong objective. That is actually not what I should be focused on. And I'm going to explain that in a future video as well.
No worries. I'm steal all the content for my video. No, I mean, I get that. Like, even when we do stuff, right, where I'm working, a lot of times we're working developers, and the goal is, we want to get, 20,000 installs a day. It's like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Like, why that number?
And by the way, I know how to get 3,000 subscribers. Like, you can, like, just looking at my metrics, and I'm going to show this in a future video.
Okay.
I figured out how I could get 50 subscribers a day. Now it's like, less than 5.
Yeah.
So I know how to do it. I just don't want to do it. And I'll explain all that.
Yeah. It's like all the teasing, right? No worries. Okay. Well, so there's a YouTube thing, right? And then I know you mentioned trying to do your own studio and everything. Forgive me, I probably should know this. Is Tiazu, I know it's on your LinkedIn, is that the studio?
That is the studio. The studio right now is just myself and my partner. His name is Paul Layden. And Paul was like, a former lead game designer on Game of War at MZ. We hired him when I worked at Fun Plus to work on this game called King of Avalon, which also wound up to be a pretty big hit. And so we have right now we have game design, product management, and publishing expertise, but it's just the two of us. And we need to now figure out how to solve the development piece. And I don't know how much of the past videos that you've seen, but we were previously aligned with and trying to kind of combine with this Chinese development studio, but that kind of fell apart. And I'm going to explain that as well. And that's one of the reasons why, when you're in this kind of entrepreneurial mode, I think the way that you measure your objectives and your goals should not be like this incremental linear thing. It's got to be a little bit more flexible, because when your environment is changing so much, the way that you measure your goals and the way that you set your objectives should be a little bit different.
Interesting. Okay. So I don't know if this ties back into it. So I have your business values deck, right?
Yeah.
And just reading it, and one of them was like wartime versus peacetime. I feel like the original way you were doing it was the peacetime gets incremental, it's more safer, but when there's just chaos everywhere, you kind of have to adapt a lot.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to throw process out the window, right? Especially when your environment is changing so much. And so for me, this is wartime. This is, really about getting results and about, thinking. I have to think about the long term, but I also have to think about the short term, because if there's no short term, there's no long term. So it is like, a very difficult, very challenging time right now, but also, one of the really fun time, right? Like this is the moment in time where you've got the biggest challenge, where, we're trying to figure it out, where, the path that we could take can go in a lot of different directions. And so there's a lot changing, but it's also very fun.
Yeah. Well, so the question I want to ask is, a lot of people are turning entrepreneurs, right? And a lot of people are probably going to start a little young and without that much experience, but you have experience and you know how to do this stuff. Going into the entrepreneur aspect of your life, do you feel like you're already prepared for it, or do you feel like you're learning a bunch of new stuff you never even thought of before?
Yeah, I think that given my experience, I probably feel a little more comfortable in the sense of knowing what I want to do and knowing the direction that I want to go. But it's still difficult, right? And even for, someone like me, when I raised money back in 2010, 2011 for a gaming studio, it was simple. Just maybe given the time, given the context, I didn't even have to try. Some people talk about talking to 30, 50, 70 companies before raising money, spending 6 months. I talked to 2 people and I had offers for money. It was so easy back then. And now it's a lot harder, I think. And so my personal experience is that way. But I will say that what age and experience has given me now is just more comfort in knowing what I want to do, and more kind of confidence in terms of wanting to go down a specific path relative to other paths, and being, being clear about, it's easier for me to say no to a lot of distractions and to things that will distract from our focus, and feel comfortable about it.
Interesting. And do you think that just kind of came with experience? Essentially?
I think so. I think that the longer you're, in the industry, I think that it's easier to apply pattern recognition to different, opportunities and to different people, and to more quickly make determinations about the path that you want to go to.
Very cool. So what kind of game are you trying to develop, right? I know you're doing the studio, but are you trying to do, is there anything specific?
I think that, right. So, for us, it's not about a specific game. And we've actually changed our game design, and again, this is, when I talk to you about how the environment changes so much, we had a development team and we lost the development team. And now we're trying to do development partnerships, and there's a few different partners that we could work with. And so given our context in terms of who we are, what we have, the games and the strengths of the partners that we have, our game designs have shifted, right? So we've changed the game that we're going to work on 3 times in the past 3 months. So, so a lot of our environment is changing, but I would say right now, if we are able to work with the team that we want to work with, then we would be working on an FPS, and a very different kind of FPS. And for us, I think that the big overarching objective for us are to make games that are able to, invoke as much emotion as possible. Because for us, we believe that art is about emotion. And so the kind of games that we make, in our experience, the kind of games that we have worked on are these 4X March Battle games. And we don't like those games in the sense that we don't want to work on those type of games anymore. But what we've learned from those games are really about social design, right? That, in a game like Game of War, a player can spend $5,000 in that game, right? In terms of the investment that they've made in the game, and they can get zeroed. That's one of the mechanics in the game, is that, some bigger, better, alliance or group of players can come in and zero you. but you're so mad you'll spend $10,000 just to get revenge.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of emotion. And that's something that we want to key on, which are making games that induce as much emotion as possible, because we believe that that's art. And so that's one of the goals for us, are to make games that are a little bit different and that are a little bit higher on the risk profile, but have social designs and mechanisms in the game design to try to induce as much emotion from the player as possible.
Interesting. And do you feel like doing all these kind of GameMakers videos and like interviews with people is helping you kind of design a better FPS?
So let me explain that. So one of the things that I mentioned to you earlier is I believe that the market is changing. So I actually gave a talk earlier this year in Colombia about what I call the brave new world of creating a game studio or any company in particular. And what I mean by that is that I believe that there is a fundamental change that will impact companies that is starting to emerge. And there are some guys out there talking about some of these things, like guys like Gary Vaynerchuk, who talks about personal brand, things like that. But what I believe is that people talk about social media. But I don't think people really understand the implications of what happens when social media becomes big. Now, there have been indications of this, right? And so, for example, when we first just think conceptually, what does social media do? Well, social media creates a one to anywhere connection between anyone in the world, right? And there's a lot of these social media kind of platforms and channels that have existed. And when we even think about someone like, who's that? Who's that? There's that celebrity, Kendall Jenner, right? Okay. And so she created a huge cosmetics brand just based upon her social media presence. And I think she, her company's like, she's a billionaire. She's worth billions, right? Off of essentially a massively scaled one-to-end connection between her and her fans. Now, if you think about, let's just talk about brand for a minute. And when you think about what has happened with brands throughout history, in the history of the world, the level of awareness of the audience to a brand has typically been at the product level or at the company level. Okay. But what happens when you have something like a Kendall Jenner that happens, right? Or let's talk about a specific industry. Let's talk about the movie industry. Now, what has happened in terms of brand and basically the audience awareness is that level of awareness is actually pierced through the company, pierced through the product level in terms of a movie. And so people want to know not just about the movie, they want to know who's the director, who are the actors. They want to know more about those people. And so I believe that similar to movies, that this will happen at the product level in other industries. And I think gaming will be one of the first industries where people aren't going to just want to know about, the game. They're going to want to know who's the lead game designer, who are the product people, who are the people who are making the game. And so one of the trends that we want to leverage with this game studio is to be as transparent as possible and to let people know, to break through the product and the company level and to know who I am, who Paul is, who the other people in our company are, and to give them that level of visibility. And there are a lot of other implications in terms of what happens when something like this occurs. And I gave a talk about that, and I'll probably record and publish that talk on my GameMakers YouTube channel sometime next year. But we're trying to leverage that trend and so to some degree, why do I do the GameMakers YouTube channel? Why do I do the Deconstructor of Fun podcast? Yeah. Because I believe that the two things are actually interrelated. And so, one of the ways in which one of our development partners who we're trying to structure a deal with now, when I went to India GDC earlier this year, and as I was going, a lot of people reached out to me, right? They're like, hey, I know you from the podcast. I saw this YouTube video on GameMakers. Can we meet? So now my cost and time for business development all of a sudden went to zero, right?
Oh, okay.
Right. And so like for me, when I went to India GDC, people recognized me and they came up to me. They presented me with opportunities because they had watched some of the videos that showed what I'm interested in, what I'm talking about, what I'm working on. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the other advantage of this, sort of, one to anywhere connection and the impact of having these type of platforms that will actually also benefit the company. So, and it's kind of crazy because some people ask me, am I a full-time YouTuber? No, I make almost nothing off of, these podcasts and these YouTube videos. But what it really does is it allows me to try to leverage that vision of my future, of the future company. And also, as I mentioned, it has a lot of benefits from the perspective of business development and awareness of what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. And so obviously I know you said to work with the studio, but a development team, or do you have any like goals or hopes? Like, I want the game to be released by this time next year, where there is no release dates. When it gets done, it gets done. Like, how are you kind of approaching that?
Yeah, I think it's all dependent, right? Like, so I think you have to take into account, what you have, what you're good at, what's potentially commercially successful in the market, and the resources that you have, and like the time for us to be able to make that stuff. Mm-hmm. So, of course, we'd love to be like Supercell or Blizzard and spend 6 years working on the perfect game. But mm-hmm. if you only have, 1 year or 2 years of runway, well, that kind of changes the kinds of games that you can make. And so, mm-hmm. But that's the whole nature of entrepreneurship. And that's what makes it fun, is like trying to be successful with the constraints that you have.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So then what is your day-to-day like now that like this is your...
Well, there are very specific projects that we're trying to get off the ground. So my day-to-day is doing whatever it takes to get those projects off the ground. And so as an entrepreneur now, it's about, what do we need to do? What's going to move the needle the most? And how are we going to finance this thing? And how are we going to mm-hmm. keep ourselves financed? Because, as a dad and having a family, I've got financial requirements. My partner has financial requirements. And, we've got a certain amount of time, but to like figure that all out so that we can, number one is survival, right? Making sure that we can survive to launch the products that we want to launch. And number two is, figuring out the specific projects that we want to work on and trying to get those off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. All right, Joseph, that's all the questions I have for today. I appreciate your time. Very cool, man. Yeah, no, I listened to the podcast myself when I'm driving to work and from work. And I think I just want to share, like, it's really cool just because as someone that's still, I've been here for a couple years now, like, new to the whole space, there's so many things that I learned about because I'm so, like, heads in the ground when it comes to, ASO or UA. There's I never thought about monetization or, releasing the perfect game. Like, I think one of the recent ones, you guys were talking about new Call of Duty and kind of having different predictions for it. It's like, I'd never even thought to look at the game that way before. Right? I just saw it's Call of Duty, it's gonna make money, it's cool. It's like, oh, actually, its IAPs weren't that good. It's like, oh, this is very educational. Yeah, definitely a great podcast. I appreciate you putting this out.
Thank you.
All right, Joseph, I'll let you go. Thank you for taking time, man, and I will talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
All right,
thanks.
Bye.
Bye.